Father in heaven, we seek to know you as you have made yourself known in divine revelation through our Lord Jesus Christ. Thus, we gather today to continue that process, a lifelong process, eternal process. We ask your blessing by the Holy Spirit through our Lord Jesus Christ that you would open our eyes to help us know and grow in the knowledge of your glory in the face of Jesus Christ, as always. Thank you so much for Jerome's present with us and giving his time. We thank you, we love you, and thank you for loving us first. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill. Good. Well, today we are continuing through T.F. Torrance's book, Theological Science, originally published in 1969, so we're a few years down the road. Nevertheless, the subjects that are raised here continue to be important for understanding Torrance and for really understanding the path ahead of us in doing theology in the world that we find ourselves in. Chapter 1 we finished last time with Tom Noble on the knowledge of God. We spent some time with Travis as well as Tom, and now we're moving slightly in a new direction, the interaction of theology with scientific development. So we're really beginning to listen to T.F. Torrance help us to understand why it is that we can even talk about science and theology as tasks that are to be thought together in some sense. Mm-hmm. So, Jerome, we're grateful for you being here with us today. If everybody doesn't have the handout, there it is posted on the website. Chapter 2, the first part of Chapter 2, pages 55 to 65. And Jerome, tell us just your background of the part of T.F. Torrance that deals with science. I mean, within the T.F. Torrance community, there are those that really focus on the ministry aspects. Mm-hmm. And there are some who really focus on the science aspects, and there are some that do both, and there are some that go beyond it in orthodoxy and other directions. So just give us a little bit of your interest and your background with the scientific aspects so we can just hear where you're coming from as we look at this section.
Right. Well, I am neither a scientist nor the son of a scientist, so let's start off there. But I do like to learn scientific things. Yep. And I do think that the discussion of the relationship between Christianity and science is invaluable and necessary. And so I appreciate Torrance's pioneering work in this regard in forging that dialogue. And particularly, as I was rereading my notes and this section of the chapter, it struck me that there's an incredible adventure story going on in the backdrop of this book, as Torrance is living through a time period and has come out of a time period when Albert Einstein has come along and turned traditional science upside down and has provided a whole new, very, very dynamic vision of the universe. And so that's exciting to people. That's radically revolutionizing the way that people looked at the world. And then Torrance, of course, got to study under Barth, who did something very similar for the world of certainly Protestant theology, if not all theology as well. And so Torrance has the privilege of being in a time period when there's incredible ferment and dynamism and rethinking in both the natural sciences and in theological science. And so he is working to emphasize the convergence between those two and to extend, to further that convergence.
And I love the word adventure there. I can hear a bit of Tolkien reflections going on there, and you're a bit of a person who brings those together, which is part of the journey. But in this opening section, there's really adventures in getting lost and trying to find the way again. That really is acknowledging that science itself has been on an adventure. And at some level, the question of where science and theology lost each other in the forest
Hmm.
That is, it's not obvious to most people that that might have happened, that there was ever a time where they were friends and why they got lost and all that. So I want to keep alive your metaphor of the adventure for those purposes. It is not easy reading, and names are put out there assuming they understand Augustine and Occam, and most people don't have a super connection with those. So we'll try and be careful to understand who they are and where the departing happened and where the possibilities are that might be there as well.
Hmm.
So interaction of theology with scientific development. I'm just looking at the chapter title. Um, Interaction is a little bit of an interesting word there. In contemporary work in theology and therapy, people talk about the integration of theology and therapy, which
Hmm.
usually assumes from psychology the individual, which means that the theological piece is going to be warped almost beyond recognition. And Torrance continually said that the social sciences need to do the kind of revision that have been done in the natural sciences. And so, as we look at this chapter today, when you look at the word interaction of theology with scientific development within your adventure metaphor,
Hmm.
how do we maintain the care that it is an interaction for Torrance that doesn't collapse one into the other?
Right. Yeah. And, one of the things that stands out to me in that title is that the word action is there in the interaction.
Mm,
Because, again, Einstein, even in spite of himself, gave us a vision of the universe that is growing. You have the Big Bang Theory that comes out against Einstein's desire of his theories of relativity. And so there is tremendous action in the universe as a whole from the very beginning. It is moving. It is a dynamic, interrelated system on the one hand. And then what you have with Protestant theology in general, and then particularly in Bartian theology or Barth's own theology, is this actualism, this focus on what God has done in
mm.
Jesus Christ, and we need to understand God in light of that. So I think one way to keep from collapsing them into each other is to pay attention and do justice to the types of activity that both discourses are talking about, and do equal justice to both.
Yeah. So, would it be fair to suggest that science got stuck in a building somewhere along the way and became static in a sense?
Mhm.
And there is an adventure component to the theological aspect that Torrance is saying we can't stay in our cubicle buildings and think that the lab is where we really discover truth. We have to be out in the world and engaging
Mhm.
reality. Is that a
Right.
fair?
Yeah, and even as far back as the ancient world and Aristotle's view and the Ptolemaic view of the universe, what C.S. Lewis called the discarded image, the pre-modern view of the universe,
Mhm,
had a strong emphasis on the regularity of the universe beyond Earth. So once you get past the moon in the Ptolemaic way of thinking, you have everything's characterized by these very regular movements, the cyclical motion of the heavenly bodies, that is the moving image of a static eternity.
mhm.
So it's as close to stasis as you can get is the cyclical motion of the heavenly bodies. And then Earth is where all the non-cyclical movements happen, and those are irrational movements.
Though they took on a kind of rationality at some point. The nature of the contingent order, the orderliness that Torrance talks about, is to say at some point the nature of order became the basis of what Christian thought provided as an orderliness. That God is the one who, in a sense, lays that orderliness out. The nature of the stars, and we read a book, The Circles of God was one of the 12 books
Yes.
that Torrance edited, and to say
Yeah.
there you go. Um, Good.
What?
To
What?
say that the nature of reading the stars as though the gods were speaking, there's a kind of dynamic there that has a sense of revelation to it that somehow contemporary astrology, which, I mean, I always have thought, astrology is reading onto the stars and astronomy is reading out of the stars, that there's a distinction. But at some point there was a sense that people thought that the gods were speaking through the stars, it was doing a listening rather than a projecting kind of sense at one point, in a kind of way, warped as it might be,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So when we think of the circles of the heavens and the whole component in the development of science that was provided by the continuity of the stars, you're saying that Torrance is pointing out a static sense of something that lost the dynamic of reality. In a sense, the foundation of the universe in which we live was so static that everything, um, it lost the dynamic that he's wanting to say needs to be there. And part of the adventure is figuring out what happens when your world is static,
Mhm.
and science loses the dynamic that is necessary to actually engage reality as it is, and particularly God,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And, the point of that book, The Circles of God, is that it wasn't until Kepler suggested that the movement of the heavenly bodies is not perfectly cyclical, that it is elliptical, that then modern scientific cosmology was able to get off the ground. But ellipses, in order to accept the idea of ellipses and elliptical movement, you have to be willing to prioritize the appearance, the empirical data, over your perfect geometric forms
Mhm.
and theories. You have to allow your theory to be conformed to the objective reality, the empirical reality, rather than vice versa.
Right.
And Tom's main point here is that you need a concept of contingency
Mhm.
that medieval theology and science did not have. That is what locked both the theology and the science in closed boxes where they could not escape. As beautifully harmonized as they were in the people who synthesized Aristotle and Augustine, like Thomas. It all held together, but it held together in a logical way based on the premise that the creation is eternal and God is eternal, and therefore they can all be integrated logically. And then all science essentially is the job of tracking everything backwards to its first cause and then finally projected forward to its telos. It's a lovely creation, but it simply could not hold up either within theology or in science, because as Jerome was just pointing out, the more rigorous you are in your astronomy, the more flaws you find. The circles are not circles; they're ovals, they're ellipses, and there are irregularities. And unless you have a way of looking at the world in a way where that does not threaten the divinity of God or the humanity of man, you're getting a real theological headache. And it's why the church, there's the late Catholic Church, especially the Church of Rome, began to prosecute scientists as heretics. That was not an obvious thing to do even 400 years before.
I'm wondering if you can use the word contingency within your adventure metaphor. And I'm asking this because Kerry Magruder has said that with non-Christian scientists who he's dealing with the nature of the history of science, that if he takes them to say, well, we have to have contingency, it actually causes them pause to say, yes, we do. And I haven't felt, and again, the word necessity is the distinctive from contingency. I haven't been able to feel the sense that Kerry seems to have himself of understanding why a secular scientist has the necessity of contingency, but not the necessity of necessity. If that makes any sense to you, and how the metaphor of an adventure and finding that contingency might give us insight into what the scientific adventure is, where that becomes something that we recognize, yeah, we have to have that.
Yeah. Well, I would defer to Carrie in terms of the history of science and the philosophy of science, but it
It's even
seems to
understanding this
me,
section. It shows up in the
yeah,
section contingency, so it's
yeah. As an interested layman in those areas, it
uh,
does strike me that there is always the pendulum effect, right? That you move from a very rationally structured system that prioritizes regular movement and ultimately prioritizes uh, stasis, immobility. Uh, you swing from that to potentially the opposite extreme of everything's got to be in motion.
mhm,
Everything's got to be evolving. There can be nothing that there can be no permanent natures, right?
mhm,
Uh, and you certainly see that in some philosophies. Like you think about Sartre and Beauvoir, for instance. There's no human nature. There's just
mhm.
my existence precedes my essence.
Yeah.
Those types of things. But within the adventure metaphor, I would say a story that has no surprises is a boring story.
Okay.
It gets critically reviewed as being a paint by numbers TV show or novel
Right.
or whatever. And so you want to have novelty. I mean, the word novelty reminds us of the word novel,
Yeah.
right? A good novel has novelty in it. There are unexpected journeys.
Yeah. Which takes me to The Hobbit
Hmm.
and, the unexpected journey. And at the end of The Hobbit, Gandalf says to Bilbo, you didn't think that you were such a lucky hobbit, did you? That, and again, that lucky in a sense that's fate and kind of a necessity, or that there's something that had no intentionality. It seems as though Tolkien is implying that there is a worldview which has a personal contingency, that the kind of the unspoken sense of the divine presence
Hmm.
guided him on that journey there and back again. And is there that sense that is being appealed to within what it is that Torrance is talking about? The nature of a contingent world requires Gandalf's insight, that we're not just lucky to have figured out patterns and all that, but that there's something deeper behind that.
Right. There's an intelligibility to the universe that is not accidental. Because it is the good creation of a faithful God, and because we ourselves are the good creation of a faithful God and indeed created in God's image, there is an interface possible between our minds and the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just accidental, uh, nor is it an arbitrary arrangement of atoms and firing synapses just crashing along through
Yeah.
the universe.
So,
Good. Go ahead, Bill.
so when Einstein, sorry, when I, only in some minds,
Hmm.
when Einstein said God is deep but not devious,
Mhm.
right? This is and Torrance paralleled that or likened that to God is light, and in him, and there's no darkness in him.
Mhm.
Just reading that recently.
Yeah.
So
So
you're saying light is a contingent upon, or the ordering of light in the universe is the contingency upon which we can understand everything else. Or
Well, it's more that the contingency does not cast darkness onto God's light. The contingency does not threaten God's sovereignty over the world.
no,
There's a rivalry there, an either or, that either it is utterly random and contingent, or it is fixed and predestined from the very beginning, that if you know the first causes, you already know the ultimate outcomes. That is the medieval world order that the reformers protested against, because they said essentially medieval theology and medieval science exclude God from creation, except as the unmoved mover. And that's not the God of the Bible. And the many people for the last century or more have been pointing out the biblical causes of the Reformation. Is that, yeah. As soon as I saw him it quoted in your handout, I said, I've got that book on my shelf. I better at least have a look at it. But the other one, if I could please point out, is Alistair McGrath. I mean, this is one of his main theses, that both science and religion were changing at the same time and in the same directions as the medieval world was crumbling all around them, collapsing under its own weight, since it could no longer explain life as we are living it, neither religiously, nor economically, nor physically, nor astronomically. All of the sciences are saying Aristotle must go. And Luther just forbade Aristotle to be taught in universities under Lutheran dominance. It was not until after his death, Melanchthon rather timidly said, well, we really do need the great philosopher, even if we're just going to argue with Catholicism. But Calvin agreed with Luther. Aristotle is not the solution. Aristotle is the problem. We do need to think theologically and philosophically without the Aristotelian prejudices. That had to go. And that...
Can you give the Aristotelian prejudice in one sentence?
That it had to do that everything can be known by its origin, its purpose, its inner and outward logic, and its telos, its end. And that is how you describe things fully and completely. And that once that has all been defined, that's it. The object has been defined. It does not change. It cannot change. And so there can be no true contingency. There's only stuff we haven't found out yet. And when we do, it all falls into place. Like every piece of a jigsaw puzzle eventually falls into place. The idea that it's evolving is horrid to both science and to religion. That's all of what was shoved behind. And I do, Crombie did a nice job. I mean, and my copies were printed in the 1950s, within my lifetime. But my copies are getting so old, the paper's getting yellow. Everything we've talked about so far are in books like this and have been out there for 50 to 70 years.
But who's talking about them?
We are.
Well, that's important.
Aren't we right now talking about it?
Peter Harrison is. Peter Harrison is making a cottage industry of reviving these insights and extending them.
But it's
good.
In my circles, they never died out. I mean, this is stuff I was reading in the 1970s because I went to a liberal arts college in America where we had a faculty of science and we had a faculty of humanities, and they had to talk to each other. And so one of the things they were constantly probing is what do the humanities and the technologies of the scientific faculty all have in common, and it is this sense of contingent reality. And it's Tom that says the contingency. Einstein insisted on contingency in physics, and biblical theologians in the early 20th century were insisting on contingency in theology. They're breaking down the old scholastic theologies, both Catholic and Protestant, and because they said they have squeezed God out of religion, and that's not biblical. We've got to change it. So that's when we pick up the Barth and the Barthian Reformation in theology, and Einstein and the Einstein Reformation, I'll say, in science. And that's what Tom noticed and said, why can't we keep thinking these things together? Which is the point of this book. I think.
Okay, good. Well, that's helpful. I'm just going to read your first paragraph here on your handout, Jerome. Theology is scientific in that it seeks to get beyond the knower's subjectivity. So now we're on the adventure. So subjectivity, we're stuck in our own head and experience, and pay disciplined attention to the object known so as to know it in its reality. In God's case, this means seeking to know God as God gives himself to be known, which is divine revelation. So the nature of the adventure there is that, in a sense, subjectivity is stuck in your own head, your own cubicle,
Your
your
own
own
hobbit
something.
hole.
Was it your own hobbit hole? I don't know. I wouldn't mind being stuck in a hobbit hole for a while, but if Gandalf knocks on the door and the dwarves show up, it's hard to turn away the adventure, I guess, especially if you're a good thief. But
anywhere from half an hour,
so
45
the
minutes, depending on how thin it comes.
the nature then of,
Do you want me to go ahead and make it so that you can have some? now?
let's see, somebody's got their mic, somebody's got talking
Oh, that
going.
could be me.
It could be you,
Yeah,
Howard.
yeah.
Okay, so again, we're starting into this chapter then on the interaction of theology and scientific development. So first of all, we have to recognize that the nature of the process of discovery that Torrance is inviting us into is a move from subjectivity, as in something that doesn't engage reality, into a kind of objectivity, which we could call the adventure, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So that in your second paragraph, theology is only part of man's total response to God. And again, response to God that's also part of the adventure. And so the question is how one engages God alongside worship, obedience, and mission. So there are four terms there: worship, obedience, and mission. And I looked at those and I said, is there anything he misses? And you threw in some other words relating T.F. Torrance's holism to is Zal, is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
Intellect,
Simeon Zal.
emotion, will, and ethics, those are the intellect, emotion, will, and ethics are terms that are often used in psychology. So cognitive, emotive, behavioral psychology in a sense, and then the nature of ethics out of that could correspond there. So tie together for me your note there and what it is that Torrance is saying and this expansion of what it means to be holistic that we're being invited into.
Right. Yeah. Well, the book, Theological Science as a whole, is quite concerned with the history of ideas, the development of ideas. It is very much an intellectual exercise. But it is important to recognize that Torrance is not Mr. Spock. He's not just concerned with the intellect for the intellect's sake or intellectualism. Always for him, these intellectual exercises are linked to and inseparable from the wholeness of the human person in the human person's relationship to the humanizing and personalizing God. And so I'm pushing back here. I continue to be creatively provoked by Simeon Zal's book, The Holy Spirit and Christian Experience, where he uses T.F. Torrance as one of his key examples of a theologian who simply talks a lot about doctrines, but never actually brings them down to earth. He never engages with human emotion, with human practice. And so now whenever I read Torrance, I notice places where Torrance actually, where there's evidence that contradicts Zal's analysis there. And this is one of those places. And really, in looking back over the book in preparation for today, another one that I found was right there in the preface, page I, where right at the beginning, he talks about how this material in the book began as a lecture series, but then he also goes on to stress his personal relationships with family and friends who were there, who were part of the dialogue, the alert minds, yes, of the students who listened, but then also their kindness, their friendship, and then the way in which we were allowed to share in their daily worship of God.
Mm.
So for Torrance, you cannot separate out the intellectual from the wholeness of the human person in relationship to God.
So to say that the nature of Torrance's vision here is that science is relational. We may happen to deal with a world that doesn't speak back. We in fact become priests of creation is the kind of language that he used. We bring voice on behalf of creation to give praise to God. And that the nature of Zoll is to say Torrance doesn't engage reality. He's just dealing with the head, but he's not indwelling Torrance's thinking enough to say that all this thinking is about our relationship to the world that God creates and the God who created it. He's got a blind spot, a pretty big blind spot.
Yeah.
And his Zoll's intellectual framework seems as though if he's going to put Torrance in a box, then he must live in a box in which he's trying to put Torrance. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, to his credit, Zoll in his book does take great pains to draw connections between doctrine and the emotional life and practice. And I think that's salutary. I just think that he ends up caricaturing Torrance in the process.
In a way that misses Torrance.
Yeah, that misses Torrance's heart and some of the data that doesn't quite square with the box that Zoll's wanting to put him into.
Right. Which, I mean, it does raise some concerns just as to what Zoll's view of science is if he can't see where Torrance is pointing in such a way that the dynamic of God who is engaged in Torrance's work isn't seen as being the one who we do worship and obey and share in that mission. To not hear those dimensions, there is something in Zoll that's not attuned to the music that is being played by Torrance, to which we hear what it is that the revelation makes available for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to affirm most of Zoll's positive project. I just think it's unfortunate that he uses Torrance as a poster child for somebody who doesn't do what he's wanting to do.
Yeah. And again, I'm working on writing a book on the science of the personal to say that science has a tendency to not engage the nature of what we call personal, that it's almost by definition has to be objective and not allow any personal opinion or anything to be included. And so to say that Torrance, in a sense, fractures that view of science and says, if we don't deal with the whole of reality, i.e., the God who creates reality and our participation in it, then it's no longer science. It's just a theory that's abstracted in a sense, and our voice is being foisted onto the world that we would call the objective world. But it's really whatever we want to foist onto it because we've lost the dynamic of the creative God and our participation in it. So to say Zoll wants there to be something that is dynamic, but he's not hearing what I would say, Torrance and Bart are the two voices that really have opened up the science of the personal as not just a possibility, but an actuality that then allows us to call into question the nature of what we call science, which is limited in a way that loses your word, the holism of reality. So it's kind of like saying, I want to study this stuff about science, I just don't want to include Einstein. Because I don't like the way he says it or something. It's like, how can you leave him out? Go ahead.
We read 4 books by other thinkers besides Torrance, mostly talking about the interrelation between science and theology. And all of them say, if you're working with a notion of science which has no emotion to it, that's not science. Science, even in science, cannot work that way. And this is Polanyi's attempt to come up with a personal knowledge. Otherwise, the science is sterilized and becomes essentially technology. And the one we had on mathematics and axiomatics and mathematics was saying you can't even do math without feelings.
Yeah.
And that's the most feelingless thing most people can think of. So we're all working. When Tom talks about the intellectual rubbish that is in the hallways of our mind, foisted on us by our education and the prejudices of centuries, get in the way of good science and good theology, and both disciplines, interrelating with each other, help one another throw out the trash, clear it out, and settle on these things. In the preface to this book, he says, I gave lectures on this at Harvard and Andover 10 years before. And they said, oh, do you mind doing a chapter on hermeneutics before you publish? And he said, it took me 10 years, because every single time I went to write this out again, I realized I had assumed something I needed to prove. He says, I'm sorry, that's why it took so long to get this book out. And then 2 more books, Space, Time, and Incarnation, and God and Rationality. That was the product of that bout of stuff. But it ought not to surprise us that in this era from the 1960 to 1969, that is what Tom was working through and working toward, without neglecting a whole bunch of other stuff, I should say.
Yeah. Good. And just to go from there in terms of that adventure and Polanyi's sense of a society of explorers, those explorers have to feel their way at some level going forward. In the second paragraph of the chapter, it is this very devotion of theology, which devotion itself is an emotional thing, right? It's a commitment of a person with all of their being to its proper object, that is the scientific passion of theology. Again, passion is one of those words that it is a emotionally involved adventure to engage something, to understand it. Its rigorous and disciplined determination sounds not emotional, and yet it is the focus of it, I think. To be properly objective, which again, there's a dimension of the feeling, has right. That is to be faithful toward and truthful with its object, which it's very easy to objectify those terms, but to say faith-seeking understanding is to have a faithful understanding where our relation to that which is other than ourselves, there's a respect, there's an honor, to be as true as possible is to be relationally faithful in a way that involves the dimension of our emotive being, I think, as well. So it seems as though he is. It's not easy to pick it up immediately, but he is doing, I think, what it is you're saying, Ken. We have to have our mind and our emotions all invested in the adventure, and we're going to do that by not shutting out any aspect of that. Right. So we have to focus our 2 eyes, to get the dimensionality that we need to then, and he uses the word penetrating through the subjectivities. To penetrate through is to not allow our mere observation as objective, but to penetrate it has an emotional dimension that hears beyond what is merely seen, to listen, to use kind of Barth's terms of Deus Dixit, God speaks, that there is a hearing of God that is going to be essential to know the God who wants to be known. And that is what science really needs to do in theology, is it has to listen well to the revelation of God in the person of Christ. Am I hearing kind of what it is that he's doing there and what you're doing in bringing these together? Jerome?
I would say, yeah, he's asking us as whole beings to engage with natural science and with theological science, and then listen, put them together in dialogue.
Yeah, which the implicit sense is, if you don't do that, then we are engaging as less than whole beings, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a call to health in how we think that is implicit in what it is that he's introducing for us here.
Yeah, or we're falling into idolatry, right? If there's not a doxological sense to how we're using our intellect and emotions and will and the ethical implications of it, then we've fallen into idolatry. Even if
Yeah.
the wholeness of who we are is engaged. I mean, cue Reformed doctrine, total depravity, right? The wholeness of holism in and of itself does not
Yeah.
get us right. The wholeness of who we are can be warped and twisted towards sin.
Yeah.
And so it's only as the wholeness of who we are is engaged in relation to ultimately God and his glory.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
we're
that's good.
fully right.
Yeah, and the word idolatry says, I mean, idolatry is not reality. It's something that we use to replace God. So to say the basic definition of most psychologies is that health or not health is some form of loss of contact with reality, right?
Mhm.
So whether it's narcissism or um, any of the disorders that are there, one is losing touch with the reality itself or with the reality of other people or something. So idolatry is that losing touch with reality. And so we're beginning a journey of getting reattached to reality that can only be defined by the nature of the God who creates and lays the foundation for understanding that within which we indwell.
Yeah.
Ken, did you want to say something there?
So we had read that essay by George Hunsinger on the element of depth in Barthian theology. That rather than that laying all science out flat or like a jigsaw puzzle on the table, you cannot see through the appearances to the realities that are invisible because they are in another layer deeper and more integrative than the layer you're looking at. And every scientist experiences this, and that's part of the point of both Harrison and McGrath and I got a whole shelf of books on the origins of modern science in the Reformation changes to Catholic theology, where as the older was breaking up, people began to see through all the pieces to a depth that reintegrated things on another level. So they were able to reform the church instead of abolish the church, destroy the church, or renounce the church and head off into atheism or some other mythology. They were able to reintegrate because they could see through and bring it together the same way as scientists could watch Ptolemy's universe fall apart and not say, well, there's no point in doing astronomy. Instead, they just followed Galileo. Galileo's good enough to say, if you keep looking at this phenomenon tacitly and contingently, order will emerge. You will never know all the order everywhere, but you'll get enough order to tell you you're on the right track. And even Einstein, in his old age, began to say, I've only, as it were, lifted a corner of the veil. But there is order there. God is deep, but not devious. It doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve.
Thank you, Einstein.
And Calvin.
And Calvin. Well, all these good people have a good party together on the adventure. The the ongoing sense then of what it is that Torrance is wanting us to move as we go on to pages 56 and 57 is the sense of theology and its relationship to the created order, which again, when I was in Dunedin years ago and sitting with the faculty, the science faculty, they said, why do people still do theology? All you've got is the God of the gaps. And I guess in reading through this stuff today, it's like, isn't there a science of the gaps too? That the nature of the boxes that get laid out by science leave out much of the presuppositions of what contingent might mean. That if it's ordered, that if you just say, well, it's just evolution or whatever, it's like, yeah, well, where did DNA come from? Where did the nature of things being alive and not dead? I mean, is there some point here where we would say that Torrance is critiquing the science of the gaps and saying we need to reintroduce a full-bodied vision that includes the nature of God as probably a better explanation than science has been able to, and that the gaps are often just trying to make the other person look weak. But science, in a sense, that whole thing of when you point at somebody else with their problems, often there's three fingers pointing back. That the very nature of what it is you're trying to do in pointing out gaps is missing the gapness of what it is that science does, so focused on what's right in front of you that it's missing the big picture. And it seems like Torrance is trying to open us up in terms of the relation of our thought processes to reality.
Yeah. I mean, even if you have established all of the, if you've built an entire piano, there are no keys missing, the piano is complete. You still have to explain, why is there a piano in the first place? Where did it come from? And it appears to be for being played.
Yeah. And the being played, I'm just on 56, the first full paragraph. Theological knowledge of God is not concerned with God in the abstract. That's God not being played with, right? That's just a theory. It's all there, but not engaged. And with God as he simply is in himself, as it were, as if our knowledge would be cut off from the fact that it is, after all, knowledge of God by man on earth and in time. And that's sitting down and playing the piano, right? If we're going to do good theology and science, we've got to sit down and play the piano.
Mm-hmm.
We have to interact with it. We have to let it be what it was made to be, and not just sit back and observe it and think that in any way we've understood that which is there. So there's the created order in the modern world, the modern scientific abstract world, is well, we can't use the word created order. We have to use the word environment, or just the nature of universe, or there is a language that has to be stripped away until somebody says evolution has designed this thing to be this or to do this. Evolution has, and the language of design, when it comes in there, I'm always shaking my head and going, where does this notion of design come from if it doesn't live within what it is that Torrance is inviting us to say that we not only might consider, but that we must consider in the language of contingency.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair thing, that Torrance is trying to overcome that distinction?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you think of like the late Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about. I think he appeals to Occam's razor, simplest explanation. There is no God. We're each free to believe as we wish. I think there's no afterlife. There's no God, but we have this one life to appreciate the grand design. And so you finish that quote and you're like, am I missing something, or is he missing something with that
Yeah.
use of that word at the end of that particular paragraph?
Yeah. Well,
And it's really tragic.
Yeah, it is tragic. And the word appreciate, it's an appreciate kind of the nothingness. I mean, there's a kind of beauty maybe, but it's missing the whole rest of the story, which, I mean, my own dad, who was a science teacher, he was an empiricist and had some of those same kind of intuitions. And so I'm constantly trying to, even though he's gone now, I'm still trying to answer his questions and to just go, why is it that somebody can look at the nature of the creativity of the world, the dynamics of day and night, the flow of seasons, all these things, and just say it all just has to be by chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what is gained by that, other than not having a God who asks us to worship, be obedient, those things that you've outlined in your second little paragraph there.
Yeah.
So it's simply a desire to be by yourself without any intrusion by God.
Yeah. It's the converse, or the opposite rather, of the medieval scientific problem, right? Because in the Middle Ages, the problem was everything was looked at as this is the thing as a sign of something else, rather than paying full and careful attention to the thing in itself. And now in the modern regime, we've swung to the opposite extreme of we know everything there is about the thing in itself, or we attempt to know everything there is to know about the thing in itself, and we value the thing in itself, but we treat as illusory the idea that the thing might be a sign of something transcendent.
Right.
Well, plus you've also got, how do you deal with the fact when you use the word design, what are the implications of that word?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's one thing to discover a design, but then when you extrapolate to go back to what the designer was, that's where things, I think, get dicey and start falling apart.
Natural theology.
That's where Hume just throws down the book and says, no, you cannot make that move. It is not a legitimate intellectual move. To say, I see pattern, which is meaningful to me, that's fine. But then to say, I see pattern that is meaningful to me, and that implies that there's a designer who is also meaningful to me, that is an illegitimate move. And that he's the one that marked it off. And that pretty well ended the Enlightenment as a religious experiment. But both Einstein, who was not a Orthodox Jew or Christian, and Karl Barth, as a Reformed theologian, say that we are able to move beyond that if we take the idea of contingency seriously. That God is the accompanying creator of all things. God can illuminate patterns of meaning in our experience, and invites us inward deeper to see, and is this congruent with other patterns of order that we also experience in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our emotional lives, in our theological lives, and in our scientific inquiry. There is not a scientific way of being human and a religious way of being human. There's just the way of being human, and they're both rational, and they can talk to each other and correct. That's the main thing. The whole argument from design, another natural theology, Barth just ruled it right out from the start. He says the premises are simply wrong, and that scientists and theologians today agree. That needed to go first. One of the first things to go, as far as Barth was concerned.
And if you visit Greece or Rome, all of the gods are built after human experience, whether it's sex or the skies or weather or whatever. It's to say that it is easy to simply create the whole divine pantheon out of human experience, and you've done nothing with God, though it appears that all of that is part of the human experience of the world. So, I mean, there's the problem, is it becomes pure mythology, which again, the famous statement by Athanasius to Arius, to mythologize, you're mythologizing, you're projecting onto God, and that is the problem of trying to read from a kind of design onto God.
There's an aesthetic logic to taking the beauties that we experience in a beautiful figure, in a beautiful building, and a beautiful tree, and try to extend that out. Plato would do this platonically to the idea, to the perfections of all of these particular instances, and that in itself looks like you've penetrated into the depths of reality, and found beauty and pattern and order there, which is pretty synonymous with their God. The problem is, how does it change? As we started out about a half an hour ago, if you have already assumed that the way to express God is to take human perfections and purify them into the perfection of perfection, you have just put God in a cage. You might as well stick a pin in it and put it in a box and put it on the wall, because it cannot change. the entire, and it cannot establish a relationship with any human being. And why anybody would want one, I don't know. With all of these things, we have not moved beyond what Torrance begins with, because this chapter so far is simply recapitulating what most science and theology of the first half of the 20th century had already come to a decision on. In this chapter, he does not expect a book reviewer to say, oh boy, did he go out on a limb on this one. I mean, he starts with a quotation from somebody's lectures from 1926, and he ends with a quotation from somebody whose book was published in 1932. He's not being radical or revolutionary in this section. He's simply saying we all agree that science and religion, Christianity, have had a long and troubled relationship, and we're now pretty well agreed that science that pretended to be religion and religion that pretended to be science built a conflict in that it took almost 150 years to get out, but we're finally getting there. And now the question is, what is the next step look like? And he's right there to say there are many, many promising opportunities for theology and science to mutually transform one another to the edification of everyone and to the glory of God. It exasperates me sometimes how many people read Tom, and when Tom won't tell them how theology is superior to science, and therefore Darwin, you can ignore Darwin and you can ignore anything else, is such a misreading of Tom. He does not declare himself on any of those points in here, just to make that point. And when he finally gets to Occam, you notice how carefully he walks around Occam to say, this is what he was able to show his time, but he's very much aware that if he lays that in front of any Thomistic Roman Catholic, they're going to go, you read Occam? No, you can't find one good thing to say about him because he's a heretic. And the entire conversation shuts down. But McGrath will tell you that. And for that matter, Harrison will tell you that. Again, this is not unique to Tom, and you don't read Tom to get what you can get out of these two books. But now you can see why McGrath in particular found Torrance so fascinating, that everything he had been thinking about the process of the Reformation was now being picked up and articulated by Torrance as where the new Reformation will come from. And that's why he got so excited. I mean, since he's not dead, you can call him up and ask him.
He doesn't answer very well. I've tried to get a hold of him, and he's. But anyway, he did come and speak for the Torrance Fellowship, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
So again, on page 56 in the first full paragraph, just the fifth line down, theology is concerned, and I would say theology as science is concerned with God as the creator of the world, and therefore with God in relation to the world of creaturely realities. And so to say that the nature of science for Torrance is going to deal with the relation of God to the created world, which technically is what systematic theology is supposed to do, but brings lenses to it that miss the dynamic of the relational God and end up with a doctrinal abstract God. So the nature of the foundation that he's laying here is to see the nature of the human participation in the scientific endeavor. We're dealing with a personal being that is God, and that God is related to this world. Everything is related, and if we can't talk about the relationships, you're probably not going to understand any of it. Right? So the nature of your fourth paragraph then, but on your handout, but theology has also hindered natural science, notably through, and you give 2 points that he makes, Augustinian eschatology of the decay of the material world and salvation as escape from it, and Augustinian cosmology that saw physical realities as purely sacramental. Can you just say a little bit more about those as part of the adventure?
Right. Yeah. And so we do need to be careful in handling Augustine, because Augustine is such a voluminous writer, and he definitely changed in his views over time. And so I think one way to read what Torrance says here, which is, I think, a flawed way, would be to turn Augustine into the source of all of our problems. Someone has said that called him the abusive church father, right?
Huh?
It all goes back to Augustine. Augustine is where everything went wrong with Western civilization in general and theology in particular, and also to unfavorably contrast Augustine with Eastern Christian theology, especially the Cappadocian Fathers. The fact is that Augustine's way of talking about eschatology and even human origins and all of that bears a great deal of resemblance to what they were saying out east as well. I mean, you have the full influence of Platonism out among the Cappadocians and in the Eastern Church and all of that. And Augustine, to his credit, he tries writing multiple commentaries on Genesis. He keeps coming back to Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, again and again and again. And over the course of his lifetime, he does progress to where he's able to say some things that the Eastern Fathers don't. He even over the course of his debate with the Pelagians comes to the point where he's able to admit that, well, maybe Adam and Eve would have had sexual relations even if there had been no fall. And so, especially toward the end of his life, as he's in dialogue and debate with the Pelagians, he is beginning to take a more literal, historical, matter-friendly view of the early chapters of Genesis. Of course, he writes City of God, which provides us our first philosophy of history. So there are things that he does, and his seminal theory where, yes, he says God created everything at once, but God created things with the capacity to grow and develop. He created them in seed form so that they could, if you will, evolve. So that's not to say that Augustine is not problematic. It is to say, though, that he's not the places where he is problematic, he's not uniquely problematic by and large. These are issues that the whole ancient church was dealing with. And there are some places where he does lay some helpful foundations for the future. But yeah, his eschatology, his tendency to idealize things, and his view of the world as sacramental, that during the Middle Ages tended to lead to a way of reading the natural world purely in terms of its sign value. So, if I see a flock of birds, I'm concerned about what this tells me about God. I'm not particularly concerned with their actual mating and migratory habits of the birds themselves.
Right. So for the scientific missing the point, the eschatology says, why would we care about the world? Because it's gonna be destroyed and left behind. Why would we learn to be scientists? That was the problem that. And the cosmology piece is it's sacramental. Why would you not just look at what it's pointing to and not at the sign itself? Is kind of, he'd say, why look at the sign? Look at what the sign's pointing to. But that also misses the point of the value of virtually everything, that it isn't merely pointing. So they're both distractions away from doing the work that science would have done. And again, Plato, reality is in the world of ideas, the world of forms. And the nature of Aristotle refocused at some level on the world as we find it. And so Aristotelian breaking everything into parts, so to speak, which Thomas Aquinas builds on the logic and reason of defining everything that is here. And your earlier comments on we have to get past Aristotle because he's the problem. I was trying to work that out in my mind. I could see where Plato takes us out of the world. So why would we do science here? Aristotle focused on the many elements of the world and breaking everything in a sense into definable reasonable sections. Why did that become the problem? Why
Well,
was
that was
Aristotle?
actually Ken who made that claim.
Oh, that was Ken. Okay.
But the the problem with Aristotle is that even though he does refocus on this world,
Yes.
the ways, the methodology that he goes about in examining things in the world tends to uh, operate out of certain philosophical presuppositions that tend to flatten out any chance of contingency. So, in terms of the four causes, if you're so fixed on where did it come from, what's its origin, and where is it headed, what's its purpose, what's its meaning, that can lead you to ignore or misinterpret some of the contingent elements of the thing in the here and now as
Yeah.
it moves from its origin to its destiny.
Right. Right. So you have two paragraphs here that use two different Peter Harrison books. So I don't know much about Peter Harrison. So can you just say a little bit about who he is and what he adds to the conversation, and then what it is that you found helpful that he's bringing to reflect on Torrance's work?
Right. Peter Harrison is a scholar of religion and science and the history of religion and science and what do those terms even mean? How have they been defined, perhaps misdefined in the modern period? And he operates out of Australia. He has a teaching post in Australia and has published quite a bit on these subjects. In the Bible Protestantism and the Rise of Natural Science, his point there is that the reformers returned to the literal sense of Scripture rather than prioritizing allegorical interpretation. They focused in on the details of and the literal sense of Scripture, but they also read the book of nature, or they prepared the way for reading the book of nature in the same way as they were reading the book of Scripture. So instead of looking at nature and interpreting it sacramentally, allegorically, people were encouraged to study the thing itself and its own details, its own peculiarities, just like the reformers were reading Scripture.
Which could have a vulnerability to natural theology. The orders of creation and things like that easily can collapse into a form of natural theology.
It can, but at least what it does is it pushes you to go out there and do empirical research and pay
Okay.
attention to, again, what the geese in the pond are actually doing rather than
Okay.
what they supposedly spiritually signify.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other book, The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science, he argues that in the early modern period, there was a refocusing on the fall as being a historical event, a historical Adam, again, as part of this concern with the literal sense of Scripture, away from allegorizing, and that early scientists were motivated to try and recover the scientific knowledge that they thought that Adam must have had before the fall. So they believed Adam had this encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world, as proved by the fact that he named the animals. And so that had gotten lost in the fall. So they were trying to recover that knowledge that Adam had had. And so a literal reading of the early chapters of Genesis encouraged early natural science, early modern natural science.
Which was helpful.
Right.
It began
The
to
only
provide
problem came
language.
in then when you get to Darwin and you have almost sort of an Oedipal story, right? Where a very historically focused, literal reading of the early chapters of Genesis serves as the father of modern science. But then by the time you get to Darwin, you have Oedipus killing his father.
Whoops. Okay. So the nature of the clarity, then we're dealing with the history, and we have these two particularly early Greek fathers, and again, the nature of the Greeks as a foundation for the thought that arises as what we call science. And just to recognize science is a human function that does reflect on that which is other than ourselves. So it's a human endeavor. And so philosophy and science bear the task of learning to think about the nature of the world and our place in it. Though many scientists don't think about a philosophy of science, that's one of the things Polanyi said, is how few philosophers of science he found. But there's an implicit philosophy in science, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, is the roots of the ways that the challenge of the separation, in a sense, of theology and science, wrestling with what do we engage, how do we look at it, what are the lenses, whether it's these abstract thoughts or whether it's so focused on what is right in front of you that it misses deeper dimensions that need to be there, pure object with no meaning. This is the journey, the challenge.
Mm-hmm. And so then once he's laid all of that foundation, he's going to look at specific instances of this general story that he's telling. He'll look at the relationship of grace and nature next, but the rest of our reading for today looks first at how the doctrine of God changes under the impact of the Reformation, and then how that influences natural
So before we move into that section, just Occam is on pages 58, 59.
Mhm.
So if you could just say a little bit about, what is his point about Occam? Ken talked about walking around him. What is
Yeah.
it we need to walk away saying it's helpful to understand Occam for understanding the argument that Torrance is making, and here's what you need to walk away with.
Right. So William of Occam is a late medieval scholastic theologian who prioritizes will over reason. So whereas earlier scholastic theologians would have stressed the reasons that God has for everything that he does, and there's this necessitarianism born of reasons. By necessary reason, if X is so, then Y is so. God must act in this way, and the world must behave in these particular ways. And what Occam does is stress God's sovereign will. And so some things may just be just because God chooses to, for God's own inscrutable reasons. We may not know exactly why God does what he does, why God makes the decisions that God does. And that then translates into the idea that there may be things in the world that we cannot perfectly explain. There may be contingencies in the world. And one of the things that Torrance stresses is that Occam has a theory of motion. So he's moving away from a more static conception of God as the unmoved mover and the universe as at its best conforming to that stasis as closely as possible. There's a theory of motion that he has. But Torrance does recognize the concern that it's possible to take Ockhamism to an extreme that would detach you from the God revealed in Jesus Christ and just have God as naked will. If the danger of earlier scholastic theologians was God as pure reason, necessitarian reason, the opposite danger arises if you run too far with Occam's ideas and just treating God as naked, arbitrary will.
And does cause and effect come from that then? That everything's in motion and there's a cause and effect, and all we do is try and trace out the nature of those dynamics?
Well, we can't, within Occam's system, you cannot predict necessarily from if you have a nice set of presuppositions, if you have a nice syllogism, you can't necessarily run that out and predict the way everything is going to be and behave, because God may just choose to do something different. And
So
so
kind
it
of
would
remember.
push you, it would encourage more a posteriori reason. Let's see how things actually behave and then work backwards from there.
Okay. So the value is that he does acknowledge there's a God. And so just the question of breaking out of a rigid abstract system into something where there is a God, God has a will, begins to open the possibility of conversation where a theology has some place to be part of the conversation, but with limitations.
Right. And
Because it isn't
theology
the
had
God
been part of the
revealed.
conversation the whole time. Is just how you conceive of God and the God-world relationship.
And whether you include Jesus. For Torrance, it's that you need Jesus and he didn't.
Well, I mean, Occam was a Christian, and so he, like Thomas Aquinas, would have acknowledged Jesus. But the question is the role that Jesus plays in the system.
Right. As the one who's the revelation of God. To do theology, if you can read off the orders of creation, then you don't need Jesus. But it lays open the possibility of natural theology and therefore all the things that Barth stands against with natural theology.
Right,
So it's a
right. You end
clarity
up
of
with a Procustrian
the
bed that you stick Jesus on.
that's right. So it's part of the clarifying process. And again, Karen Magruder says, when we study the history of science, there's no part that we can leave out because we don't like it. We have to acknowledge all the parts that were there. And yes, the corrective parts, and maybe things that people still believe that were corrected a long time ago, but they didn't get the memo.
Mhm.
So we have to acknowledge all of it to even recognize the things that many people haven't seen that scientists may have gotten. And so to understand Occam, which my dad was one who would use the phrase, he'd use Occam to say, the simplest answer is the best answer, and therefore, I don't need God. And he
Right,
literally, the pastor's kid, who talked about converting out of Christianity because it was a simpler answer for him to
right.
have no God.
And the problem with that is Occam's razor, properly stated, is the simplest explanation that takes account of all the data is the correct one. I
Uh-huh.
mean, the fact is, it is far simpler to believe that the Earth is flat and the sun goes round the Earth than it is to believe in heliocentrism or a round Earth or that sort of thing. But reality does not conform to our extremely simplistic, overly simple
Uh-huh.
explanations. So it's the theory that accounts for all the data as simply as possible.
Right. Now that's
Uh,
a helpful clarification. It's a little bit aligned to the book in the series of the 12 that says the statement, why is there something rather than nothing, is quite abstract, but to ask why is there this something rather than some other is asking that question about accounting for the data of this reality as we find it. And now you have something that grounds science and theology within the particularities of the a priori reality that is there and has to account for them.
right.
Yeah, good. That is helpful. Thank you. So then on into the change in the doctrine of God. So he's laid this foundation of these particularly Greek roots and acknowledging that much of science came from Greek roots, though there's going to be later on discussion of the Christian development of it, that the Christian worldview gave us something was important as well. So, from a static, stoic, Aristotelian view of divine immutability and passibility, which that's just a static world, right? Everything's fixed. It's almost the container Newtonian in its deepest
Right.
ancient kind of roots. To a dynamic biblical view of God as active creator and redeemer. And we could say, see Einstein for later development of this thought. I mean, in a sense, though he didn't do it the way Torrance wants to. There is the move from the static to the dynamic. So the nature of theology and science is that to move together, we have to acknowledge a dynamic world and be willing to not put it all in a box. Right? We have to let it live in its dynamic to be
Mhm.
able to actually understand. So you can study an animal dead on the table. It's just not nearly as exciting as seeing it in the nature its natural environment doing what it does and discovering what goes on there. And so
Right.
that's back to the adventure of science and the adventure of theology need to allow for the appropriate functioning of those places in the context in which they actually thrive and exist,
Mhm.
and not put into a museum. So the medieval view, he's going on with this adventure through history, a hierarchy of being. This I'm looking at your handout, and
Mhm.
implicitly eternal creation as the object of God's eternal knowing and willing. Is that a re-objectifying? Is that a putting back into the box?
Yeah, his concern is that, for instance, Thomas Aquinas will, as an article of faith, Aquinas will say that the universe had a beginning, but Aquinas is perfectly happy to argue as a philosopher that the universe could be eternal and still be created. And so there's this concern that you don't have any true contingency. You have God and the world together forever in this unchanging relationship.
And that's based on an abstract idea rather than anything to do with the God revealed in the person of Christ.
Right.
That God
Yeah,
creates space and time.
that good and evil is defined by how things were created in the first place. So that the fall is problematic and the redemption is problematic. I'm trying to find the phrase as you put it right here, that an eternal pattern to be read off the face of nature, thus in effect substituting nature for God. That is, that which is natural pleases God. Then you transport that into ethics. Doing the natural thing is the godly thing, and doing the unnatural thing, however you define that, is the ungodly thing. Then the authority of the church swings in to keep things essentially as European culture defined the natural relationships between male and female, between the ruler and the ruled, between the white and the black, between all of these things, which were, as far as Europeans were concerned, was plain as day. You could read it right off of nature. That's good. And anything that changes that, is evil almost by definition. And it's again why Galileo was put in under house arrest.
So that's common sense thinking. It's common sense to us, and then just reading on what makes sense in the created order, which J.B. Torrance talked about, the orders of creation. When people would say, what's wrong with creation? And, it's orderliness. It's like, well, it's fine until you're a woman who's told we're men and we're smarter and stronger than you.
Mm-hmm.
And those people, that different color, we're smarter than them, we're better. And it's like, well, where did you get all that? Well, just look at them. It's common sense. And so again, it's being foisted onto the orders of creation rather than reading off the nature of God's creative purposes.
This what Tom alludes to is the habits of our thought, this inherited habituum. Right. It's always a problem of correcting theology. Everybody sits there. If you think you need to correct it, there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with my theology.
Yeah. Which, if we put the adjective, the prejudicial habits of our thoughts, that we tend to prejudge in ways that are inclined to serve ourselves.
Yeah.
That is part of the sin nature, is that we have this inclination to see how it's going to work out for ourselves. And so the nature of our reading of nature is what's going to work for me. That becomes individualistic, breaks down relationship, and all those other things.
But the Gothic architecture, Gothic art, all of the wonders that have tourists going gaga, and we're just about to open Notre Dame. It was so worth rebuilding and restoring. That all came from this medieval view that there is hierarchy in creation, placed there by the Creator, and it is the goal of art, architecture, music, and philosophy to reveal that and then find the beauty of God behind that. This is why Saint Denis is considered the patron saint of France. Was because this is how you are devout and civilized and law-abiding and ordered in your society but it's because of hierarchy and the great chain of being, which locks everything into a feudal mentality, and that begins to break up in the 1400s.
So the nature of a culture and its perfections are read onto God, and amazingly, God just approves everything that culture approves.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of a symbiosis that goes on.
But God commands
Like
it
we don't have to deal with that
and
anymore,
punishes
right?
anyone who departs
Yeah.
from it.
For what
Howard,
is,
you want to say something?
yeah. Well, it's probably a side note, but I've been working through Bonhoeffer on a lot of different levels, and I came across this idea of the orders of creation. And Bonhoeffer went off against it because the Nazis were using it to justify and
Yes.
to whatever their view how the world was. But it was interesting. I traced it back, and it did come from Barth, and he started off supporting it, or at least I'm not quoting it, but then later on, it was interesting. He says orders of creation are nothing but a human fabrication because it is not based on something God has revealed to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
there's
it
a
was
tension
one-
in there between Reformed theology and Lutheran theology, because a lot of
Right.
Lutheran ethics start with what are the orders of creation,
right.
God's
Yeah,
revelation.
if
But-
you look at the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, one of my rabbit trails led me there, and they based their very solid, fundamental rejection of women in ministry on the orders of creation, that you can't
Exactly
argue with that. I found that very interesting.
Yeah. Helmut Tillicher is a German Lutheran theologian, wrote volume after volume on systematic theology and ethics to help the Lutheran churches who were sucked into fascism to find their way back to an evangelical and an Orthodox Lutheranism. So give it a try.
Yeah. So to say, in this section, the development of thought, medieval thought developed something that acknowledged nature but collapsed God into nature in a sense, so that the intent of God became sleight of hand move. It became human intuitions of what God was doing rather than listening to God. And then we move on page 61 into reformational scientific view. So this is an improvement, right? So tell us a little bit about, from your handout there, the reformational scientific view. How do we think about that?
Right. So with the literal reading of Scripture, accompanying that comes a concern for things as they are in themselves. Let's pay attention to the details. These things in all their variety, in all of their contingency, are good creatures of God. And so we need to pay attention to them rather than too quickly moving off into a spiritualizing, generalizing, homogenizing direction. And you see some of that in the Dutch painters, right, who come out of the Reformation, who celebrate. They're painting peasants who are harvesting their fields. There's this celebration of common people in the midst of the ordinary details of life.
Yeah.
So contingency is a key issue, and then also recognizing the godness of God. God is not just a cog in the wheel, so to speak.
Yeah. And I hear particularity there as well, that the nature of generalizing, when people say all men are this way, all women are this way, all Americans are this way, the allness of it is the generalizing that misses the particular, which makes it not the best science. The more you can get into the particular of the way things are, you can notice that there are continuities between women, men, humans generally, but to also leave space open for the particularity is the scientific investigation that allows the reality of each particular person to be revealed, and particularly the nature of the particularity of God, though he doesn't fit into any class of any other. And even using the word person, we have to say, if we're going to use the word person, God has to define it, and then we'll ask whether or not we are persons responsibly to that.
Right.
And that's a reading of Scripture that, in a sense, is giving the particularity to not just a God concept, idolatry, but that there is a particular God, and that religion isn't just the human sense of religiosity. If there is going to be something that is a way of engaging the divine, it's not just about us, Schleiermacher, the human sense of dependence on the other. There's something about the actuality of God that defines all that. So is that starting with the Reformation then, is that whole attitude, that shift of dealing with the reading of the Bible, we're dealing with the particularity of God, the particularity of humanity, the particularity of the world as we find it?
Right.
Right. So that has both a theological and a this world. I mean, you can see there the roots of a cooperative dimension of theology and science there, right?
Mhm.
And is this when the universities started to come into being and they were, I mean, people say that many of the contemporary atheists who are in Oxford and all that forget that the very schools they were in were founded bringing together a scientific study of the world because they believed that the queen of the sciences was theology and gave us the framework within which the universities gave rise. So is what we're putting out here the Reformation? Is there a cultural phenomenon in the universities that see theology and science in a sense working together to understand the world and our place in it at that time?
Well, of course, the universities were a product of the Middle Ages, so they were already up and going. And theology is the queen of the sciences. Thomas Aquinas taught, in a university. Oxford was already there, and so forth.
Okay.
From the later Middle Ages, from the High Middle Ages onward.
Uh-huh. The schoolmen, the scholastics, but they did have a theological. So I get okay. The question then is, what is Torrance's point of what the Reformation does beyond what the universities rising out of the schoolmen, the scholastics, are doing? What is the helpful move of the Reformation that Torrance wants to highlight for us?
Right. It is the breakup of the medieval synthesis that allows the universities to begin to explore these questions in a modern scientific manner, and individuals to do empirical research, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Now, just to illustrate, to get an MD, a doctorate in medicine, in a medieval university before the Reformation, you had to study Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and others, and you sat around and you cogitated about health and wholeness, the natural harmonies of things and all that. If you needed to get a gangrene limb removed, you went to a dentist, because they're the ones with the saws and the hammers and the ability to knock you out for a while and take the diseased leg away. And all the doctors were deeply, deeply offended when after the Reformation, they were told essentially all of their literary learning and their philosophical background and why they had to get an MD and not a PhD in medicine was because they didn't know dork about human anatomy and how it worked. It's one of the pride things about the Scottish universities is they reformed themselves before Oxford and Cambridge. And the rivalry between Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Oxford and Cambridge was that medical students like Benjamin Rush here in Philadelphia went to Edinburgh to learn real medicine because they weren't going to learn it in Oxford. That it was still doing the old aristocratic elitist type of thing. That the goal of Luther and Melanchthon to reform the universities was the same as their goal to reform the church. It was to get the institutions they had to teach the new knowledge. And the universities mostly followed along with that, but there was still this Aristotelian prejudice that eventually brought Aristotle back in. And if you had a Roman Catholic scholasticism before, now you just got a Protestant version of the same thing. It took a second Reformation beginning in the 1800s to begin to break that up and dispel it.
So this, I'm just looking at your, it's your second complete paragraph on the second page of your handout. The problem with medieval scholasticism is that its questions put to nature were so philosophically controlled. And so I'm hearing that's the nature of the university in the medieval form of it. And they became controlling, which didn't allow for the adventure that we've talked about to go on, to be able to do the work of understanding the particularity of the world as we find it. The Reformation, was it even with everybody being able to read the Bible for themselves? Was a move towards the investigation of the Bible? Was a move towards a kind of individual engagement with Bible and world? Is that part of the movement there?
Oh, that certainly helped because
Yeah,
now you're expanding the culture of intellectual discourse
right.
beyond its traditional narrow confines, and you're hearing fresh voices. You're
Mm,
hearing the voices of the yeoman farmers. You're hearing the voices of the ordinary people.
mm. So again, just to say there is an opening up of the ability to investigate, discover, et cetera. And again, this is all part of the thesis that Torrance is developing, that a world where people are not locked into abstractions and distant gods and things that are just necessary. So why would we even deal with them? Because they're just necessary. That now we have a world of contingency where things can change, have changed, they develop, and they are developing. And God contingently came into the world the person of Christ. Therefore, we can ask, well, what's he doing here? What is the contingency upon which that kind of action is happening?
Mhm.
So in your next paragraph, exemplar of the shift from medievalism to modernism, Occam's views of causality, irreducibly of sequences of events in nature to a purely logical set of relations. Can you say a little bit about that? Give an example of that?
Well, that's summarizing Torrance's point that his concern is that prior to Occam, you had this line of logico-causal connections among things. That if I can create a syllabus, not a syllabus, a syllogism for it, then this must be the way that it works out in reality. And Occam, because of his prioritizing of will over reason, is able to say that may not necessarily be the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting. I've just been doing a series on the heart of the Father, and to say we know the heart of the Father as the will of God, not my will, but thine, Jesus says, that there is a sense of the personal that we discern and we see the action of God. The kingdom of God is where the will of God is worked out.
Hmm.
And so there is this aligning with the nature of the will of persons that gives us insight into what we even call understanding,
Right.
right? And when
But again, the stress has to be on the will of God as revealed in Jesus Christ, because
yeah,
otherwise Ockhamism spins off into this naked will, this inscrutable sovereign, almost like the Leviathan of
yeah,
Thomas Hobbes's political philosophy.
yeah. But we could also see Bart's point that what is evil? It's doing that which God doesn't will. The will becomes central. And so to say the nature of sin is that we are willing what
Mhm.
God doesn't will. And so now we have a reference point to understand the nature both of who God is, but a beginning to understand the nature of evil in the world as the human choice to not be aligned with who God is and what God's will is for us. The nature of motion, which you go on there, the stress on dynamism, that's the opening up to a dynamic world that's not locked in boxes.
Mhm.
I'm trapped within the medieval scholastic framework, Occam's voluntarism, nominalism, and split into faith and reason. Do you want to just unpack those words a little bit?
Well, Torrance's point is that because Occam was still operating within the medieval scholastic framework, his views sounded like they would land the world in a situation of utter chaos and irrationality. It was highly disturbing. It seemed to cast aspersions on God, God's character, God's creation, just because of the medieval scholastic framework in which he was proposing these things. So his voluntarism was to stress on will, being primary. Nominalism, that there are not these abstract universal entities like goodness and the form of the good, or things like that. These are just
naming of
names that we
generalities.
give. Yeah, we generalize, and so we then just make up names to classify things together. That would be his nominalism. And then the split between faith and reason, that you just have to trust God or believe in God, and reason doesn't necessarily support that. You don't necessarily have good reasons for understanding why God does what God does, or anything like that. I mean, Occam even is reputed to have said that God could have chosen to make us hate him if God had wanted to. And that sort of extreme talk would disturb any of the faithful, not least the more traditionally minded medieval scholastic theologians.
Yeah.
Just to refer back to Tom's essay on philosophy and theology, that the problem of evil was the tough nut that philosophy could not crack. And here Occam, as somebody who's just living life, knows that there are certain things that simply philosophically cannot be resolved. And he is willing to say, I'm going to have to trust God anyway. So there's a slight breach there between reason, which has rendered this unknowable, and faith, which says, I'm going to trust God anyway, because God is God. That is not going to ultimately satisfy the church. And in the meantime, the church is experiencing peasant rebellions, heresy. Heresy goes rife from here on in. We have Whitfield, we've got all these other things. There are the people who are vested in keeping the hierarchy intact, good people, honest people, but in the hierarchy, as far as they're concerned, was inspired by God, given by God for the peace and the purity of the world. And to have all of these peasants running around saying, I'm going to think for myself, and having all these scientists running around thinking, I don't believe in these old unities and necessities, and to have philosophers sitting back, I don't know that this Aristotelian, Augustinian synthesis really works, and it may not be logical, and it certainly isn't biblical, and that causes the entire tower to shake, and it's part of the reason why Occam came out of the Middle Ages with such a black name. It's even when you read Gilson on the philosophy of the Middle Ages, he says essentially that philosophy in the Middle Ages reaches its perfection in Thomas Aquinas. Well, that's the early Middle Ages. It's got 3 centuries more to go till you get to the 1500s and Luther. What were they doing, thinking, philosophizing, praying for all that time? It was a really inadequate view of what was going on in the Middle Ages. And that is why I keep holding up Alistair McGrath. This is somebody who's read the stuff, thought about it, and gives you a good general synthetic summary of what almost everybody is now saying. So just to say, Marty, you had said, is this Tom's thesis? It says essentially, no, he hasn't gotten to his thesis yet. It's giving you the foundation of intellectual consensus in theology and in science for the whole of the first half of the 20th century. When he gets that down, then he can move on to his thesis. This is how the church responds.
It's a little bit, you're in the wilderness, you were lost, you don't know it, but I'm going to show you where you got lost. You weren't listening to the guide that could have led you. You started depending upon your own sensibilities or your sense of where beauty drew you, and now you're on the edge of a cliff and you don't know how to get out of there. And I mean, he's in a sense, he's laying out the problem at many levels in what it would look like, and the separation between the proper guide, i.e. the nature of the God who would reveal God's self, and the nature of humans depending upon their own natural instincts to find something of the nature of the world, the meaning and purpose of the human, all these things. But those things just basically got us lost. So yeah, he's showing us the nature of the division and the lostness of the the ways that
Yeah.
people ended up. We're here
And
at the
in
Reformation.
this particular point, he is saying we have been through this before.
Yeah.
The Middle Ages went through intellectual torture and came out with modernity in the 1500s. And that then became the way philosophy and science and theology was done for the next 300 years. Now it has become unstable again. So we can learn from this experience, but their experience is not ours. Our experience is different and unique, but we are going to get through this. But here in this prelude chapter, we're still laying down his basic axioms. It's to say the church came through this before. We call it the Reformation. We are now heading for a new Reformation. What is that going to look like? And it's not going to be dictated by a few ecclesiocrats, and certainly not by Tom.
Right. So the nature of, we were lost in the wilderness, but we found our guide, and our guide had the maps of the areas, the Bibles, that it's the revitalization where now we know where we are again. We know the person who can give us a truthful recognition of where we are. Now we can go forward. And the question of what is a new Reformation or a new theology, that's going to be part of what Tom's pointing towards in the interaction of theology and science. Now we can use the maps, we can follow the guide, and we can go forward in the discovery process in a way that we weren't able to. Is that a fair analogy with the adventure?
Try the Israel in the wilderness. Moses does not have a map. He has a pillar of cloud and fire.
But the Reformation, the Bible was the map that was refound. The Bible hadn't been read, in a sense. The ability of the translations that made the Bible available for people, that gave people the ability to read a map that they'd never had before, in a sense, and to begin to ask questions and understand what it was of the God who's known in the person of Christ. And it includes the Old Testament and Israel in the wilderness. I was using the map metaphorically to say the Reformation was a move towards something new because the Bible became available in translation that people could read, and the nature of the Enlightenment and the ability of humans to read, to think, and to think critically. It was a converging point of coming together with tools to go where they hadn't been going before. And so I think Tom is saying science had the ability to breathe in a way that gave something that allowed for science and theology to work together thoughtfully, even if they didn't agree.
Yeah. And so the question then is, where to from there, right?
Where to from there, yeah.
Now that Einstein and Barth have opened up these broad new frontiers in each of their areas, what can we do to build the bridges to generate further convergence?
In the time that we're in right now. I mean, he's not talking historically there. He's talking about because we have Barth and Einstein, we are in a place to ask those questions here in 2024, right? The new theology, we could say he may have been writing this in 1869, but the question is still the same question, right? That question has not really been answered in a way that has come to dominate the world of how we should think and go forward. Meaning most people I talk to, when I say I write on Karl Barth, they say, who's that?
Yeah.
People know Einstein, but they don't know anything. They can't, if you said, tell me something you know about Einstein. Well, he was a smart guy. It's about as much as they can say.
Yeah.
So the nature of the work still to be done that is being pointed to, I think Tom would, if he was here today, he would say, we still need to do the work of living into what it is that he's attempting to lay the foundation for. Before your questions, the shift from medieval categories of substance versus accident, essence versus idea, matter versus form, potentiality versus actuality, and four causes, to modern categories of forces, motion, laws, and changes of mass in space-time. That's the move from the world, up to Newton, is who I think Torrance sees all of those things kind of coming to a head in him, and then Einstein is the move beyond into all the nature of science dealing with the relativity of the world. Is that a fair categorization of what you're pointing towards?
Yeah, and again, I'm just paraphrasing him, but certainly forces, motions, laws, you have Newton talking those terms. Space-time is Einsteinian.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're just what we're doing in this second chapter is we're saying the family got blown apart, and now we're coming back together, and we can see that the transitions have some specifics that we can talk about as we continue to develop from here. But if we didn't have these pieces of the puzzle, we wouldn't know how all the pieces were moving around. So now we're ready to keep moving on and ask, what does it look like to think theology and science together?
Yeah.
Yep. And so you have two questions here. The first one related to Alfred North Whitehead. Do you want to just clarify the question and point where it takes us in terms of our adventure?
Right. So Torrance appreciatively cites Whitehead's acknowledgement that Christianity historically has been the midwife of science. But of course, Whitehead then goes beyond that to create a new synthesis. Whitehead is very excited about the dynamism of the universe as revealed by Darwin and Einstein and so forth. And so he wants to rethink not only all of cosmic reality or physical reality, but also God in terms of this dynamic movement, this process. Everything is this Heraclitean flux, including God in Whitehead's system of process philosophy, and then process theism is developed out of that. And so the question is, process theology has the dynamism and the attunedness to contemporary science that Torrance prizes. And it wants to dispense with older ideas of immutability and impassibility on God's part, which are all areas that would overlap with some of Torrance's interests and concerns. But the flip side of that coin is that process theology's view of God goes a lot further away from the tradition than what Torrance would, and ends up collapsing God and the world together into this codependent relationship where the contingency of creation in relationship to God is not preserved.
And if anything, God is contingent upon, God is in an evolutionary process,
Right.
kind of being dragged along by the creative process of the world. So there's a collapse that takes place there, and God loses the integrity to be God. It merely has to kind of submit to becoming what God is, because that's what the process requires.
Right. So, in other words, we need to be careful when Torrance celebrates the new dynamic view of the universe and things like that. We need to be careful not to get carried away by that celebration of the universe's dynamism and take it farther than what Torrance did, if we're going to stay true to Torrance's own understanding.
Right. So to say that people often get worried about Einstein's use of the word relativity because they think of relativism, where everybody has their own truth, instead of saying we need to understand how everything is relative to each other, impacts, influences. So when we understand the nature of Torrance's vision of God, then all that is created has reference to God by virtue of being relative as the created to the creator. And therefore, science has the opportunity to recognize the particularity of everything in its dynamic of being related to everything else. Read Einstein there. And now you have Einstein and Barth and Torrance, in a sense, wedded in their methodology of the particularities and the relativities, all in dynamic involvement, but nothing being collapsed into one or the other.
Right. Because even for Einstein's theories of relativity, there is an absolute light. And so in Bart and Torrance, the absolute is Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And Bart and Torrance likes to use as the metaphor as well. Young Yale, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I read that Einstein regretted calling his theory theory of relativity because of the implications to philosophy. He said that it should be properly called theory of invariance, in that space, if you measure things in space, they change. If you measure them in time, they change. But if you measure them in space and time together, then they are invariant. That the transformation maintains something,
Right.
rather than, that it's not purely arbitrary relativity.
Yeah.
There's nothing divine about relativity. It is a rational understanding of our world as we experience it when we are fundamentally honest about it. There are relativities, but the whole.
Can we say relationalities there? That there's a relationality that we have to pay attention to each thing in relation to the other.
If you believe that relations do exist between subject 1, subject 2, and subject 3, but they are not predicted by any theory of relativity. Relativity can be completely abstract and dead as far as, and it's just in motion. And Jerome's allusion to some of the physicists who essentially curse God and die is that you can find all sorts of motion and change and dynamic things going on in the universe, but that does not yet put you in the lap of God. That is
okay. I need to cut you off because Jerome has to go in just a minute here. So I just quickly want him to say something about his last question, and then we'll sign off. Can you say anything about your second question there?
Well, just in the evangelical circles in which I run, there's a lot of attempt to reappropriate Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism, and then even beyond that, some are advocating openly Christian Platonism. We need to get back to Plato. And so that raises some concerns about, well, what would Torrance think about that, right? If he's seen progress in moving beyond that, what are we going to lose if we go back in there?
And so you're asking the question, how does Torrance's view have any place or anything other than realism in the arts? Was the final well, actually, what effects might such efforts have on Christianity's relationship to science? So you're saying if everybody's going to Platonism, then everybody becomes somewhat abstract ideals, abstract values, abstract all that, and the realism gets lost, and maybe science gets lost. But even science,
the conversation between Christianity and science shuts down potentially.
Okay.
Yeah, we just become sort of obscurantists, mystics.
No.
And a lot of
the
people
flip side of that coin is, what's driving this passion for Platonism, getting back to Plato and all that? Well, part of it is because of the sense that in focusing on things in themselves, we've lost things as signs. We've lost meaning, and so how do we hang on to meaning without falling back into a medieval sacramental worldview?
Right. So to say the issues of the Middle Ages and all that fell apart, then we are in a sense moving where we're potentially falling back into abstractions that move us from the reality of the world. And Torrance would say that's a dead end going that way. If Christianity goes that way, you've actually just lost reality, you've lost God, and we no longer have a voice in the world.
Yeah, and the flip side of that coin is if science keeps on trucking in a secular mindset without truly engaging with faith, then you lose meaning.
Right.
And so you've got to have both. That's why this conversation, Torrance's conversation between faith and science, between Christianity and science, is so vital. So you've got to have both together. Otherwise, you end up with reductionisms that do not satisfy, a mess of pottage that loses your birthright.
On both sides. So we end up with a world where we're neither paying attention to reality nor the meaningfulness of it.
Right. Or the Bible.
Well, that too. Well, good. Thank you so much, Jerome, for your investment in preparing this and for the interesting places you took us today on our adventure. And I think everyone benefited from just a lot of wonderful clarification and just enjoying the adventure with you. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
What was the name of that book? That's McGrath's book, right?
Right. The
What's the name of
Intellectual Origins of the European Reformation.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Blessings on you all,
Everything Jerome
friends.
said is in this book. Right, so,
And I think next week is the American Academy of Religion, so we won't be meeting next week, I believe. Is that right? Today's the or is the AR in 2 weeks? It may be 2 weeks. I have to look at my schedule. Anyway,
all
for
right.
today, farewell, bon voyage.
Thanks.
Well,
Bye.
Thank you, Jerome.
I'm correct.